Today, we're going to be speaking with Alana Newhouse, who's the founder and editor-in-chief of Tablet Magazine. We're going to be talking about a term, brokenism, which I think is super interesting, and it sort of puts a different perspective on what, maybe Alana, in our program, we often see as like a left-right political divide only, and that's the analysis we make, and we sort of don't go any further. You talk about brokenism and status quo-ism. Talk a little bit about how you first thought of this framework and what you mean by it.
Sure. So 2 years ago, I wrote a piece called Everything is Broken. In it, I tried to articulate what felt to me like an experience that not only I was having, but a lot of my readers were having, and a lot of people who I knew were having, which was the sense that a lot of the institutions in American life and society that we have to interact with, whether that's our kids' schools or health insurance companies, um, or the IRS, felt like they were not functioning properly. They felt broken. Um, in the wake of that piece, I got a tremendous response to it. It was really incredibly gratifying. And one of the greatest parts of it was that I ended up getting emails from a bunch of people who became regular correspondents with me. And one of them became a friend, and his name is Ryan. And I talk about this in the beginning of the follow-up essay on brokenism, where at one moment Ryan looked at me and said, I don't even know what I am. I don't know if I'm a Republican or a Democrat or if I'm a liberal or conservative. All I know is that I believe in the basic premise of your piece, which is that things feel broken. And so I guess I believe in brokenism. And that kind of articulated an idea for me that I thought was very clarifying, because it felt to me like that actually was a thing that people believed from all over the spectrum. And so I tried to write a second piece that articulated what I thought a brokenness perspective on the world entailed.
Sometimes when I'll have a more detailed conversation with folks who have this general idea that there's a lot of things that aren't working, but they might identify as being on the political left or on the political right, one of the things I've experienced is that when you really get details from them about what are the ways in which some of these systems aren't working and what's your instinct about the solution, it seems to align much more closely with what we would be considered a left-wing view. Now, that may be my bias in who I'm talking to, but very often it will be the revelation I have that there's a lot of discontent with many systems, but a lot of people don't seem to realize that the solutions they are gravitating towards are actually more aligned with one side of political spectrum than the other. And that's sort of like a concern to me that people aren't acknowledging that. Do you experience the same thing when you talk to some of these folks, or is my view maybe partial or biased?
What I think I probably experienced something a little different from you, but what I guess I would say is that one of the things that people talk to me about is not only the solutions that they're looking for, but also the diagnosis of the problem. And if in a funny way, if I could say, what I think might be the case, even maybe for the people that you're talking to,
Yes.
is that the solutions that they're grasping for, no matter what part of the spectrum they come from, end up being solutions that would be associated with the left. But the diagnosis of the problem sounds a lot like people from the right.
Mm.
And that's also interesting, right? Because then we can have a conversation that can be generative, where we can say, oh, okay, so maybe I come from the left, but I can talk to somebody from the right, because actually what we could agree on is what's causing some of these problems, even if we disagree on what we would do to replace them. And that, to me, part of the reason why I set out this different way of seeing things is because also I was trying to get people out of their entrenched teams and get them talking to each other and finding the areas of the landscape on which they might agree.
One of the things that I've experienced at the anecdotal personal level when interviewing former extremists like KKK, neo-Nazi types, etc., is that they all tell a very similar story of the circumstances that made them vulnerable to getting pulled into these movements in the first place. And it's a lot of things that weren't working. It was a lot of broken things that were going on. Is this I mean, not everybody becomes a KKK member, obviously, or a neo-Nazi, but there seems to be a radicalizing effect of a lot of these things that just aren't working for people. Is that accurate?
I think it is. And I think that people who study extremism might find overlapping themes or uh, events in some of what I write about. Um, and it's part of what's a challenge here is a friend of mine actually wrote and said, Alana, I sort of agree with you. I see what you're saying, but I mean, come on. Is it really monocausal? How did all of these institutions get broken at the same time? How is that even possible? So many of them were started at different times. And so, of course, the answer is quite clear, which is technology. Like we did have one thing happen. Um, and if you actually look back to the Industrial Revolution, this exact same thing happened in society.
Hmm.
When you have an economic revolution that changes the means of how we live, it then comprehensively, almost in a cascade, changes all parts of life. It changes religion, communication, the postal service, like it changes everything. And as a result, we have to adjust. I think the same thing is happening now. All of our institutions were faced with the challenge of needing to embrace and adjust themselves to new technologies. Some of them adjusted better than others, and some of them are breaking under the pressure.
Yeah, Neil Postman wrote quite a bit about this in his books, Technopoly, and then also Amusing Ourselves to Death. And there's a
Yeah.
sort of structural argument there about, in linguistics, there's this idea. It's not, I don't know that it's completely universally accepted, but it's much explored that the language you speak actually impacts your worldview to some degree, based both on a combination of syntax and the culture surrounding it and the vocabulary. The technologies that we have, including social media or television or whatever, actually are deterministic to some degree about what issues make it into the news media or how do we approach problems or whatever the case may be. It's that sort of argument that would explain the timing, I think, of what you're talking about.
Yes, absolutely.
So Neil Postman would say there's really no going back, and it's about how do you try to regulate in order to harness the parts we want, but to limit the parts that don't work so well. When we think about solutions, do you agree with that?
Yes. I think that part of the, and in this interview, I've talked a lot about the brokenness perspective, but part of what I tried to do with the essay was also articulate the other perspective, the sort of warring perspective, which I also find incredibly compelling, which is the belief in what exists, and the belief that what exists may or may not need some reforming or need some tweaking, but that you simply don't throw whole institutions or systems out the window, especially when those systems are are the basket for people's needs, sometimes in their safety and their livelihoods. Status quoists believe that we need to work very, very hard at fixing our current institutions. In a way, I think, an incredibly inspiring and exciting conversation to be had if you put those two groups together. Because what you get is you say, oh, how about instead of fighting and trying to convince each other to join sides we're not going to join, what if together we look at the landscape and we almost assess, like do an assessment and say, what are the institutions that need reforming? What are the institutions that need radical reforming? And what are the institutions that need complete replacement? And let everyone do their part. Let the brokenness look at something and say, this is broken, I'm burning it to the ground and I'm starting again. And let the status quoists reform what might actually be salvageable.
The difficulty in that, as great as it sounds, is that there is a big divide about what's worthy of totally being destroyed and starting from scratch and what needs to be reformed. And you mentioned education. Last week, in a 48-hour period, you had Candace Owens saying the solution to the U.S. being poor at math is breeding for math skills like the South Koreans do. And then 2 days later at CPAC, she says we should get rid of the Department of Education. It's like, you don't need to breed, you need to teach. But they want to but on the left, I think we would not say we need to get rid of the Department of Education. So it seems that the disagreement would come in which institutions fall under which of the two categories.
So you're right. And look, if the people that you're trying to create conversation with are people who are political rhetoricians, that's a challenge that's very different from my own.
Right.
I'm actually looking to create to generate a conversation that feels fruitful among regular people
Okay.
and people who actually are maybe people who belong to the same town.
Right.
But who feel differently about the solutions or differently about the institutions of their world. And they're invested at a personal and granular level in those institutions. And they are not grandstanders who are just looking to make broad points. These are people who actually want to get their hands dirty. They just don't know in what way. They don't know if they want to get their hands dirty by completely abandoning their local school district because it's become too corrupt,
right,
or by reforming it, getting different people on the board. And those are, to me, those are decisions that actually do have to get made at a local level and do have to get made person by person, town by town, community by community. And then I think it generates trends nationally and maybe even internationally.
Super, super interesting. We've been speaking with Alana Newhouse, who's the founder and editor-in-chief of Tablet Magazine, and we'll link to the articles that we've been sort of talking about in this conversation. Alana, really appreciate your time and insights.
Thanks so much for having me.